Hello and welcome to
Wednesday's Night Out
with your host Joseph, Turnpike Plaza 365 Rec Squad. We will be reading Built to Last: Successful Habits of Visionary Companies. Jim Collins, best-selling author of Good to Great, and Jerry I. Perez, authors. More than 1 million copies sold. Chapter 7. Try a lot of stuff and keep what works. Yin Yang symbol. Preserve the core to the left. Stimulate progress to the right. To my imagination, it is far more satisfactory to look at well-adapted species, not as specially endowed or created instincts, but as small consequences of one general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, 1859. Our company has indeed stumbled onto some of its new products, but never forget that you can only stumble if you're moving. Richard P. Carlton, former CEO, 3M Corporation, 1950. Failure is our most important product. R.W. Johnson Jr., former CEO, Johnson & Johnson, 1954. In examining the history of the visionary companies, we were struck by how often they made some of their best moves not by detailed strategic planning, but rather by experimentation, trial and error, opportunism, and quite literally accident. What looks in hindsight like a brilliant strategy was often the residual result of opportunistic experimentation and purposeful accidents. Consider the following examples at Johnson & Johnson, Marriott, and American Express. Johnson & Johnson's accidental move, late consumer products. In 1890, Johnson & Johnson, then primarily a supplier of antiseptic gauze and medical plasters, received a letter from a physician who complained about patient skin irritation from certain medicated plasters. Fred Kilmer, the company's director of research, quickly responded by sending a packet of soothing Italian talc to apply on the skin. He then convinced the company to include a small can of talc as part of the standard package with certain products. To the company's surprise, customers soon began asking to buy more of the talc directly. J&J responded by creating a separate product called Johnson's Toilet and Baby Powder, which became a famous household staple around much of the world. According to J&J's own official history, the Johnsons got into the baby powder business quite by accident. Even more significant, the company thereby took a tiny incremental step that eventually mushroomed into a significant strategic shift into consumer products, an accident which eventually grew to become 44% of J&J's revenues and as important to its growth as medical supplies and pharmaceutical products. Later, J&J stumbled upon another famous product by accident. In 1920, company employee Earl Dixon created a ready-to-use bandage made of surgical tape with small pieces of gauze and a special covering so it would not stick to the skin. For his wife, who had a knack for cutting herself with kitchen knives. When he mentioned his invention to the marketing people, they decided to experiment with the product on the market. Eventually, after a slow start and a never-ending process of tinkering, Band-Aid products became the biggest selling category in the company's history and further solidified J&J's accidental strategic move into consumer products. Marriott's opportunistic step into airport services. In 1937, 10 years after opening his first root beer stand, J. Willard Marriott had built a chain of 9 profitable restaurants staffed by 200 zealous employees trained in the company's meticulous methods of customer service. Marriott clearly had a system that worked. With plans to double the number of restaurants over the next 3 years, the future prospects of the emerging company never looked brighter. J. Willard and his management team would certainly attain great success, and just as certain have their hands full, if they simply focused on executing the restaurant expansion plan. But what to do about the odd emerging situation at Marriott Shop Number 8? Located near Hoover Airport in Washington, D.C., Number 8 had attracted an entirely different clientele than other Marriott shops. Passengers on their way to catch a flight began purchasing meals and snacks which they stuffed in pockets, paper bags, and carry-on luggage. "Well, how about that?" said Marriott during an inspection visit to Number 8. "Coming in here and buying things to eat on the plane." "Every day," his store manager explained. "We get a few more of them." Marriott pondered the situation overnight. According to Robert O'Brien in the book Marriott, the very next day he paid a visit to Eastern Air Transport and created a new business arrangement whereby Shop Number 8 would deliver prepackaged box lunches directly onto the tarmac in a bright orange truck with Marriott's logo and lettering on the side. Within a few months, the service expanded to American Airlines and catered 22 flights per day. Marriott soon put a full-time manager in charge of the emerging business, with the mission to fully develop it at Hoover and expand it to other airports. Airport services evolved from the seed of that unexpected opportunity to become a major business for Marriott Corporation, eventually reaching more than 100 separate airports. Marriott could have bogged down in long meetings and strategic analysis to decide what to do. The unusual clientele at number 8 presented Marriott with an odd variation to its traditional customer base. The company could have ignored it, but chose instead to experiment, to actually test and see if this odd variation might prove to be a favorable variation. Marriott made an incremental shift in corporate strategy by quick, vigorous action taken to seize upon a stroke of unexpected good luck. The step looks brilliant in retrospect, but in reality was simply the result of an opportunistic experiment that happened to work out. American Express's unintended evolution into financial and travel services. American Express began life in 1850 as a regional freight express business, essentially the 19th century equivalent of the United Parcel Service. In 1882, the company took a small incremental step that turned out to be the genesis of a dramatic strategic shift. Due to the increasingly popular postal money order, American Express faced declining demand for its cash shipping services, similar to an armored car service. In response, Amex created its own money order. The American Express order became an unexpected success. 11,959 of them sold during the first 6 weeks. Amex aggressively seized the opportunity and began selling the product not only at its own offices but also at railroad stations and general stores, and thereby began unwittingly to transform itself into a financial services company. A decade later, in 1892, American Express President J.C. Fargo took a European vacation where he found it difficult to translate his letters of credit into cash, a problem, and therefore an opportunity, which impelled a further shift in the company's trajectory. In his book, American Express, 1850 to 1950, Alden Hatch wrote, "On his return, Fargo stalked through the corridors of 65 Broadway with more than his usual preoccupation. He walked right past his own office to that of employee Marcellus Berry. Berry, he said, omitting a salutation and going straight to the point, I had a lot of trouble cashing my letters of credit. The moment I got off the beaten track, they were no more use than so much wet wrapping paper. If the president of American Express has that sort of trouble, just think what ordinary travelers face. Something has got to be done about it." Berry did indeed do something about it. He created an elegant solution which requires simply a signature upon purchase and a counter-signature upon redemption, which eventually became known around the world as the ubiquitous American Express Traveler's Check. The mechanics of the Traveler's Check gave American Express an unexpected bonus. Due to lost checks and delays, the company sold more orders than it redeemed each month, which created a cash cushion. According to John Friedman and John Meehan in House of Cards, unintentionally Amex had invented the float, a mere 750 at the beginning. The float would eventually top $4 billion by 1990, generating 200 million in revenue. The company had virtually and accidentally created a new international currency. And what started as just another incremental opportunistic step, the traveler's check further evolved American Express toward financial services. Amex didn't plan to become a financial services company. Nonetheless, it became one. The traveler's check also contributed to the company's completely unintentional evolution into a travel service company. In fact, President J.C. Fargo issued a clear, unambiguous dictum that American Express was not going into the travel tourist business. We want it distinctly kept in mind at all times and in all places and by all the company's forces that this company is not and does not intend going into the touring, travel services, business, emphasis, ours. In spite of Fargo's dictum, that's exactly what Amex did. The company had developed a pattern of solving the customer problems and quickly exploiting opportunities, an impulse guided by its core ideology of heroic customer service that could not be easily suppressed, even by the CEO. Soon after the company opened its first European traveler's check office in Paris in 1895, an entrepreneurial employee named William DeLibba began expanding the company's activities in response to the needs of American travelers that always crammed the Paris office, clamoring for check cashing, mail services, travel schedules, tickets, advice, and so on. DeLibba had to be careful and low profile, of course, so as not to raise the ire of J.C. Fargo. So he moved incrementally, experimenting with ticket windows to sell berths on steamships. Using his successful experiment as a foot in the door, DeLibba convinced the company to open a travel department and began selling train tickets, packaged tours, and a range of travel services. By 1912, Amex had firmly established itself as a great travel organization, though even yet it did not admit the fact emphasis ours. By the early 1920s, DeLibba's experiments had turned travel-related services into the second most important strategic pillar of the company, behind financial services. Thus, through a series of incremental steps, most of them opportunistic and certainly not part of any grand plan, American Express had evolved into something entirely different from its original founding concept as a freight express business. Corporations as evolving species. What should we make of these examples from J&J, Marriott, and American Express? We might be tempted to just ignore them as weird aberrations, but they weren't the only such examples we found. Bill Hewlett told us that HP never planned more than 2 or 3 years out during the pivotal 1960s, nor did the company have any grand plan in mind when making its watershed strategic move into the computer business. Quite the opposite. In 1965, HP designed its first small computer simply to add power to its line of instruments products, explained former chief executive John Young. It was basically an under the bench thing. We didn't even call it a computer, we called it an instrument controller. Although we knew computers would be important in the future, we wanted to maintain our reputation as an instrument company and did not want to be known as a computer company. Similarly, Motorola initially entered the field of advanced electronics, transistors, semiconductors, integrated circuits, simply as a natural outgrowth of its small Phoenix laboratory set up in 1949 to develop a few electronic components for use in the company's televisions and radios. Only later, in 1955, did Motorola make a conscious strategic choice to move into the electronics business, and that's simply because the company could not afford to build an advanced plant unless it sold some of the output to outside customers. We could go on with examples from Citicorp, Philip Morris, GE, Sony, and others. Don't get us wrong. We're not saying that these companies never had plans, but we were surprised to find so many examples of key moves by the visionary companies that came about by some process other than planning. Nor do these examples merely represent random luck. No, we found something else at work. These provocative examples led us to a second type of progress. The first was BHAGs, stimulated by the visionary companies to a greater degree than the comparison companies. Evolutionary progress. The word evolutionary describes this type of progress because it closely resembles how organic species evolve and adapt to their natural environments. Evolutionary progress differs from BHAG progress in two key ways. First, whereas BHAG progress involves clear and ambiguous goals, we're going to climb that mountain. Evolutionary progress involves ambiguity. By trying lots of different approaches, we're bound to stumble onto something that works. We just don't know ahead of time what it will be. Second, whereas BHAG progress evolves bold, discontinuous leaps. Evolutionary progress usually begins with small incremental steps or mutations, often in the form of quickly seizing unexpected opportunities that eventually grow into major and often unanticipated strategic shifts. Why lead into the topic of evolutionary progress with examples of unplanned strategies? Because evolutionary progress is unplanned progress. Indeed, if we look at species in the natural world through the lens of strategic planning, we might easily conclude that they were the result of executed plans. They're so well adapted, they must have been created exactly that way as part of a brilliant overall strategic plan. How else could we explain them? But from the perspective of modern biology, such a conclusion would be dead wrong. After the Darwinian Revolution, biologists came to the understanding that species were not directly created in a specific pre-planned form. They evolved. Not only that, they evolved by a process with remarkable similarity to how some of our visionary companies become well adapted to their environments. Darwin's theory of evolution applied to visionary companies. The central concept of evolutionary theory and Charles Darwin's great insight in that species evolve by a process of undirected variations, random genetic mutation, and natural selection. Through genetic variation, a species attains good chances that some of its members will be well suited to the demands of the environment. As the environment shifts, the genetic variations that best fit the environment tends to get selected. That is, the well-suited variations. The well-suited variations tend to survive, and the poorly suited tend to perish. That's what Darwin meant by survival of the fittest. The selected surviving variations then have greater representation in the gene pool, and the species will evolve in that direction. In Darwin's own words, multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. Now consider a company, say American Express, as analogous to a species. By the early 20th century, American Express found its traditional freight business under siege. Government regulators eroded the company's monopolistic rate structure, and in 1913, the U.S. Post Office began a competing postal post system. Profits fell 50%. Then in 1918, the U.S. government nationalized all freight express businesses, creating a cataclysmic industry change. Most freight companies disappeared as the government snatched away their core business. But for American Express, its experiments in financial and travel services described earlier proved to be formidable, albeit unplanned, variations that were better suited to the changed environment than its traditional freight business. These variations were then selected at the path to evolve beyond its traditional and now obsolete line of business, and on which to base its future prosperity. We like to describe the evolutionary process as branching and pruning. The idea is simple. If you add enough branches to a tree variation and intelligently prune the deadwood selection, then you will likely evolve into a collection of healthy branches well positioned to prosper in an ever-changing environment. For a more detailed discussion on evolutionary theory, we highly recommend reading books by Stephen Jay Gould, especially Hen's Teeth and Horse's Toes and The Panda's Thumb, and books by Richard Dawkins, especially The Blind Watch Taker. To this day, Johnson & Johnson consciously encourages branching and pruning. It tries lots of new things, keeps those that work, and quickly discards those that don't. It stimulates variation by fostering a highly decentralized environment that encourages individual initiative and allows people to experiment with new ideas. At the same time, J&J imposes rigorous selection criteria. Only those experiments that prove to be profitable and that fit with J&J's core ideology get to remain in the company's portfolio of businesses. With his oft repeated statement, failure is our most important product, R.W. Johnson Jr. understood that companies must accept failed experiments as part of evolutionary progress. And in fact, J&J has had a number of prominent failures to prune away in its history, including a foray into cola stimulants made from sherry and cola nut extract and colored casts for children that met an early demise when the pure food dyes turned bed bed linings into a symphony of colors and hospitable laundries into bedlam. It has also had more recent failed ventures in heart valves, kidney dialysis equipment, and ibuprofen pain relievers. Failures at J&J have been an essential price to pay in creating a healthy branching tree within the context of its core ideology. In spite of these setbacks, the company has never posted a loss in its 107-year history. J&J's financial success makes the company look to outsiders like it was all mapped out by a strategic genius. In reality, J&J's history is filled with favorable accidents, trial and error, and periodic failures, summed up Chief Executive Ralph Larson in 1992. Growth is a gambler's game. Similarly, Walmart's phenomenal success in the 1970s and 1980s can better be understood by an evolutionary perspective than a creationist perspective. In fact, the folks at Walmart have always been somewhat amused by the primary explanation of Walmart's success, frequently taught in microeconomics textbooks and MBA strategic planning courses. As Jim Walton summed up, we all snickered at some writers who viewed Dad, Sam Walton, as a grand strategist who intuitively developed complex plans and implemented them with precision. Dad thrived on change, and no decision was ever sacred. Indeed, the tools taught in most corporate strategy courses utterly failed to capture how the company's strategic competitive advantage came to be, how Walmart attained its brilliant system in the first place. The Walmart system came into being not primarily by a strategic plan formulated by economic genius, but largely by an evolutionary process of variation and selection. Multiply, vary, let the strongest experiments win and the weakest die. That's exactly what Walmart made a habit of doing from time Sam Walton opened his first store in 1945. Walmart looks like it had brilliant foresight, just as it looks like a species was pre-planned and created. As a Walmart executive described, we live by a motto: do it, fix it, try it. If you try something and it works, you keep it. If it doesn't work, you fix it or try something else. Walmart's famous people greeters, for example, did not come from any grand plan or strategy. A store manager in Crawley, Louisiana, was having trouble with shoplifting, so he tried an experiment. He put a friendly older gentleman by the front door to greet people on their way in and out. The people greeter made honest people feel welcome. Hi, how are you? Glad you're here. If there's anything I can tell you about our store, just let me know. At the same time, the greeter sent a message to potential shoplifters that someone would see them if they tried to walk out with stolen merchandise. No one at Walmart, including Sam Walton, had conceived of anything like the greeter concept before the Crowley manager put it in place. Nonetheless, this old experiment proved effective and eventually became standard practice across the company and a competitive advantage for Walmart. Using Walmart as an example, we can rephrase Darwin's quote at the beginning of the chapter so it might read like this. It might be far more satisfactory to look at well-adapted visionary companies not primarily as the result of brilliant foresight and strategic planning, but largely as consequences of a basic process, namely, try a lot of experiments, seize opportunities, keep those that work well, consistent with the core ideology, and fix or discard those that don't. Of course, we should be careful about making a wholesale analogy from biology to business. We do not think all visionary company adaptation and progress comes from an undirected evolutionary process. Certainly, it would be inaccurate to view corporations as exactly like biological species. For one thing, companies do in fact have the ability to set goals and plans. Species do a lot, and certainly our visionary companies do set goals and make plans. Even Walmart, which has simultaneously pursued both BHAGs and evolutionary progress throughout its history. It uses BHAGs to define a mountain to climb and uses evolution to invent a way to the top. Jack Welch and at General Electric embraced this paradoxical mixture of goals and evolution in a management idea labeled planful opportunism, as described by Tichy and Sherman in Control Your Own Destiny or Someone Else Will. Instead of directing a business according to a detailed strategic plan, Welch believed in setting only a few clear, overarching goals. Then, on an ad hoc basis, his people were free to seize any opportunities they saw to further those goals. Planful opportunism crystallized in his mind after he read Johannes von Moltke, a 19th century Prussian general influenced by the renowned military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, who argued that detailed plans usually fail because circumstances inevitably change. For another thing, the process of variation and selection in human organizations differ from a purely Darwinian process in the natural world. Darwinian selection with species is natural selection, an entirely unconscious process whereby the variations that best fit with the environment survive and the weakest variations perish. In other words, species in the natural world do not consciously choose what variations to select. The environment selects. Human organizations, on the other hand, can make conscious selections. Furthermore, evolution in the natural world has no goal or ideology other than sheer survival of the species. Visionary companies, on the other hand, stimulate evolutionary progress toward desired ends within the context of a core ideology, a process we call purposeful evolution. Of course, all companies evolve to some degree. Evolution happens, whether we purposefully stimulate it or not. The real world is full of chance events that affect the trajectory of life. It happens to the individual people. It happens to the organizations. It happens to entire economic systems. And this is the crucial point. Visionary companies more aggressively harness the power of evolution. This brings us to the key point of the chapter. If we'll understand and consciously harness evolutionary processes can be a powerful way to stimulate progress. And that's exactly what the visionary companies have done to a greater degree than the comparison companies. Of course, purposeful evolution is not the only type of progress stimulated by visionary companies, nor do all of them use it extensively. Some, such as Boeing, IBM, and Disney, have relied more heavily on BHAG stimulated progress. After all, it would be difficult to build an incremental Boeing 747. Others, such as Merck Nordstrom and Philip Morris, have relied more on continuous self improvement, as shown in a later chapter. Nonetheless, wherever they fall along the continuum, the visionary companies have harnessed the power of evolution to a greater degree than the comparison companies in 15 out of 18 comparative cases. See table 8 See table A7 in appendix 3. 3M, the mutation machine from Minnesota and how it blew away Norton. During our interview with Bill Hewlett of HP, we asked him if there is any company that he greatly admired and saw as a role model. He responded without hesitation, 3M, no doubt about it. You never know what they're going to come up with next. The beauty of it is that they probably don't know what they're using to come up with next either. But even though you can never predict what exactly the company will do, you know that it will continue to be successful. We agree with Hewlett. Indeed, if we had to bet our lives and on the continued success and adaptability of any single company in our study over the next 50 to 100 years, we would place that bet on 3M. The great irony, of course, is that 3M began life as a failure, a big mistake, dealt a nearly lethal blow when its initial concept to mine corundum failed. See Appendix 2. The tiny company tried for months to come up with something, anything, that might prove viable, according to Virginia Tuck in their book, Brand of the Tartan, The 3M Story. The board of directors met every week during the cold November of 1904, seeking a solution. The founders were determined not to give up on the company. Fortunately, their employees felt the same way. Everyone offered some personal sacrifice, including some working for free, to keep the company going. Finally, the board agreed to the suggestion by one of its investors that 3M should shift away from mining and becoming a manufacturer of sandpaper and grinding wheels. What else could it do with all that unusable low-grade grit coming out of its failed mine? So out of desperation, more than careful planning, 3M gave up mining and made a strategic shift to abrasives. 3M official name is Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. Enter William McKnight. From 1907 to 1914, the company struggled with quality problems, low margins, excess inventory, and cash flow crisis. But under the quiet and deliberated urgings of a bookish young accountant turned sales manager named William McKnight, the company began tinkering and experimenting with product improvements that kept the company viable. Just barely. In 1914, the company promoted McKnight, still in his 20s, to general manager, an instinctive clock builder. McKnight quickly set aside a 5 by 11 foot corner storage room, invested $500 for a sink and glue bath for experiments and testing, and thereby created 3M's first laboratory. After months of experimentation with an artificial mineral, 3M introduced a new and highly successful cloth abrasive called 3M Ite, a product that propelled 3M to its first ever dividend and was still listed in 3M's product directory 75 years after its invention. Although shy and unobstructive on the outside, McKnight carried within a McKnight carried within an insatiable curiosity and unrelenting drive for progress, frequently working 7 days a week to further the cause of the fledgling 3M Corporation, and always looking for a new opportunity that the company might pursue. For example, in January 1920, McKnight opened an unusual letter to read. Please send samples of every mineral grit size you use in manufacturing sandpaper to Francis G. Oakey, manufacturer of printing inks, bronze powders, and gold ink liquids, Philadelphia. 3M didn't sell raw materials, so there was no business to transact. But McKnight curiosity picked and on the prowl for interesting new ideas that might move the company forward, asked a simple question. Why does Mr. Oki want these samples? 3M thereby stumbled into one of the most important products in its history. For Mr. Oki had invented a revolutionary waterproof sandpaper that would prove immensely useful to automobile manufacturers and repaint shops around the world. As an aside, Oki had requested samples from numerous mineral and sandpaper companies, but none except 3M had bothered to ask why he wanted the samples. 3M quickly acquired rights to the technology and began selling wet or dry brand sandpaper. But that's not all 3M acquired. Indeed, wet or dry wasn't even the most valuable part of the transaction. McKnight, the consummate clock builder who always focused on building the organization, didn't just sign an agreement with Oki and thank him. He hired him. Oki closed his shop in Philadelphia, moved to St. Paul, and became a key player in developing new inventions at 3M until his retirement 19 years later. Branching and pruning at 3M. 3M's near fatal early days had made a big impression on McKnight. He therefore wanted 3M to have enough internal variation to protect itself. Our eggs were all in one basket at the beginning. The failed mine, by diversifying products, it was unlikely a trade war would hit them all at once, and at least part of our business would always be profitable. But as his hiring of Oki illustrates, McKnight did not want the evolution and expansion of the company to depend only on himself. He wanted to create an organization that could continually self-mutate from within, impelled forward by employees exercising their individual initiative. McKnight's approach was captured in phrases that would be chanted often by 3Mers throughout its history. Listen to anyone with all original idea, no matter how absurd it might sound at first. Encourage, don't nitpick. Let people run with an idea. Hire good people and leave them alone. If you put fences around people, you get sheep. Give people the room they need. Encourage experimental doodling. Give it a try and quick. McKnight intuitively understood that encouraging individual initiative would produce the raw material of evolutionary progress, undirected variation. He also understood that not all such variation would prove favorable. Mistakes would be made by giving people the freedom and encouragement to act autonomously. But the mistakes he or she makes are not as serious in the long run as the mistakes managed will make if it is dictatorial or undertakes to the tell to tell those under its authority exactly how they must do their job. Management that is destructively critical when mistakes are made kills initiative, and it's essential that we have many people with initiative if we are to continue to grow. In fact, 3M first attempt at self-mutation beyond sandpaper and foray into automobile wax and polish introduced in 1924 proved to be a costly mistake, and the company eventually discontinued the line. But its second mutation proved wildly successful. Working in the give it a try atmosphere created by McKnight, a young 3M employee named Dick Drew visited a customer site, an auto paint shop, and overheard a violent explosion of particularly vivid profanity. Two-tone auto paint jobs had become popular, but the improvised glues and adhesive tapes separating the two colors failed to mask properly, leaving behind ugly blotches and uneven lines. "Can't anyone give us something that will work?" yelled the paint man, storming across the paint shop. "We can," responded the 3M visitor. "I'll bet we can adapt something at our lab to make foolproof masking tape." Drew discovered, however, that 3M had no such readily adaptable product in the lab. So like any true 3M'er, he invented one. 3M masking tape in response to an opportunity disguised as a problem. A process to be repeated thousands of times. 3M had finally made its first incremental shift away from sandpaper. 5 years later, in response to companies that had contacted 3M looking for a waterproof packaging tape, Drew built on the masking tape technology and invented a product destined to become a household item worldwide: Scotch cellophane tape. Scotch tape wasn't planned. No one at 3M had any idea in 1920 that 3M would enter the tape business, and certainly no one expected that it would become the most important product line in the company by the mid-1930s. Scotch was a natural outgrowth of the organizational climate McKnight created, not the result of a brilliant strategic plan. Even more important than Scotch tape itself, however, was the fact that 3M institutionalized the evolutionary process that led to Scotch tape. Richard P. Carton, director of research and later president of 3M, codified the strategy of variation and selection in 3M's technical guidance manual as early as 1925. "We must process a two-fisted generating and testing process for ideas. Every idea evolved should have a chance to prove its worth. And this is true for two reasons. One, If it is good, we want it. 2, if it is not good, we will have purchased our insurance and peace of mind when we have proved it impracticable. Figure 1A, branching evolutionary tree at 3M. It's a tree diagram. Words to the left, words to the right. I will start at the bottom and go from left to right. Trampan paper for printing to the left. To the right, Stymark pliables, markings for pavements. Also to the right, above, Centerlight paint. To the left, Nextel paints. To the right, Greenlight powder. Above that, on a branch, Scotcha film. To the left, Coated brand reflective liquids. To the left, above, 3M porous structures. To the left, porous bearing. To the right, reflective tire sheeting. Above that, to the right, reflective fabric. To the left, Scotch Rock reflective runway and pavement markings. To the right, plywood inspection. To the right above, warehouse conveyor systems. To the left, patchwood for plywood. To the right, but still to the left, on a branch, glass bubbles. To the right, remote sensing railroad car identification. To the left, control tack adhesive. To the right, radiating microspheres. To the right, radiating microspheres. To the right of that, retrospective identification. To the left, laser fusion targets. To the left of the bark, still, but to the right, microspheres. To the left of the bark, above, data guard security films. And to the right of the bark,